In the spring of 1972, the United California Bank stood on Laguna Boulevard like a monument to permanence. Its facade was clean, modern, almost sterile, a deliberate rejection of the ornate banking halls of the past. This was the new America, confident and engineered, where security wasn't theater but science. Inside, beneath the polished floors and fluorescent lighting, lay something that had taken 2 years to build and cost nearly $500,000, a vault that represented the absolute cutting edge of protective architecture. The vault door alone weighed 20 tons. It was forged from manganese steel, nearly a foot thick, reinforced with layers of drill-resistant alloys that had been developed in collaboration with military contractors. The locking mechanism was a masterpiece of precision engineering, a time-delayed combination system that required 3 separate officials to input their codes in sequence, each unaware of the other's numbers. Even if someone managed to obtain all 3 codes, the vault was programmed to remain sealed outside of designated hours. No exceptions, no overrides. The designers had thought of everything. But the door was only the beginning. The vault itself was a cube of reinforced concrete, rebar reinforced and encased in additional steel plating. The walls were 2 feet thick. The ceiling was poured concrete with embedded sensors designed to detect vibration, temperature changes, or any attempt at penetration from above. The floor was similarly fortified, sunk deep into bedrock with seismic sensors that would trigger alarms if anyone attempted to tunnel from below. Every surface had been calculated, tested, stress analyzed. The architects had run simulations for explosives, cutting torches, hydraulic spreaders, even theoretical attacks involving experimental military hardware. This wasn't paranoia. This was the direct result of a decade that had seen American banks hemorrhage millions to increasingly sophisticated criminal operations. The late 60s had witnessed a surge in organized crime's interest in financial institutions. Gangs that had once focused on armored car robberies and payroll heists were now studying blueprints, recruiting engineers, investing in equipment that could breach what was previously considered impenetrable. Banks across the country were in an arms race with criminals, each robbery leading to new countermeasures, each countermeasure eventually overcome by new techniques. The United California Bank Vault was designed to end that cycle. It represented a line in the sand, a declaration that certain thresholds of security could not be crossed. The bank's marketing materials didn't hide this ambition, they celebrated it. Brochures distributed to potential commercial clients featured cross-section diagrams of the vault, technical specifications printed in proud detail. Safety deposit box customers were given tours, invited to witness the massive door swing shut, to hear the pneumatic seals engage and the combination tumblers fall into place. The bank wanted people to see it, to understand that their valuables were protected not just by locks and guards, but by the full force of American industrial engineering. What made the vault truly formidable, though, wasn't just its physical construction, it was the layered security protocols surrounding it. Access to the vault required passing through 3 separate checkpoints, each monitored by closed-circuit cameras that fed into a central security office manned 24 hours a day. The guards themselves were rotated on irregular schedules, preventing anyone from establishing predictable patterns. The alarm systems were redundant, wired through separate conduits so that cutting one line wouldn't disable the others. Even the ventilation system had been designed with security in mind, with grates too small for human passage and internal sensors that would detect any tampering. The confidence wasn't limited to the bank's management. Law enforcement officials in Los Angeles had pointed to the United California Bank Vault as an example of how financial institutions could protect themselves in an era of escalating crime. Insurance companies had assessed it and offered premium reductions based on its security rating. Armored car services used it as a temporary holding facility for high-value transfers, trusting its defenses more than their own vehicles. In the collective imagination of Southern California's financial community, the vault had achieved a kind of mythological status. It was the place where the most valuable things went to be absolutely, categorically safe. This belief ran deeper than mere statistics or engineering reports. It was rooted in a particular American optimism about technology and progress, a faith that human ingenuity could solve any problem, overcome any threat. The same spirit that had put men on the moon just 3 years earlier had built this vault. The same precision that guided missiles and powered submarines had been applied to protecting wealth. There was a poetry to it, a kind of civic pride. When people deposited their jewelry, their bearer bonds, their cash in that vault, they weren't just trusting a bank, they were trusting the entire edifice of American technological superiority. But mythology, no matter how carefully constructed, is always vulnerable to those willing to study it closely enough. Somewhere in the same city, in the same moment this vault was being celebrated and trusted and relied upon, there were people watching it with different eyes. People who saw not an impenetrable fortress, but a challenge. People who understood that every system, no matter how sophisticated, was ultimately designed by humans, and humans make assumptions. Chapter 2. Amil Dinsio didn't look like a master thief. At 42, he carried himself with the unassuming demeanor of a small business owner, the kind of man who might run a hardware store or manage a bowling alley. He dressed conservatively, kept his hair neat, spoke in measured tones. In his hometown of Youngstown, Ohio, neighbors knew him as someone who worked odd hours but always paid his bills on time, who kept to himself but wasn't unfriendly. What they didn't know was that Dinsio had spent the better part of 2 decades studying the architecture of security systems with the focus of an engineer and the patience of a scholar. His education had been unconventional but thorough. He'd started in the late 50s with simple alarm bypasses, teaching himself the language of circuits and sensors through trial and meticulous error. By the mid-60s, he'd moved into vault mechanics, obtaining technical manuals through connections in the locksmith trade, sometimes posing as a contractor to tour bank facilities and photograph their security setups. He never rushed. Every job he'd pulled before had been preceded by months of observation, planning, and rehearsal. He'd developed a philosophy that separated him from the smash-and-grab operators who dominated headlines. Crime, if done properly, was a craft that rewarded preparation over improvisation. The idea for the United California Bank job had come to him through a chance conversation in 1971. An acquaintance mentioned the vault in passing, describing it as impenetrable, and something in that word caught Dinsio's attention. Impenetrable. He'd heard it before, applied to other targets that had eventually yielded to patient analysis. Within a week, he'd obtained promotional materials from the bank, studied the architectural firm that designed the building, and begun making quiet inquiries about security protocols in California banking institutions. But Dinsio understood his own limitations. A job of this scale would require skills beyond his expertise, specialists who could handle aspects he'd never attempted. He needed people he could trust absolutely, which in his world meant family. Over the next several months, he carefully assembled his crew. His brother James brought experience with demolition and construction that would prove invaluable for understanding structural vulnerabilities. His brother-in-law, Charles Mulligan, had worked in alarm installation before drifting into theft, giving him intimate knowledge of how detection systems actually functioned versus how they were marketed. Each member was recruited not through criminal connections, but through blood, a closed circle where betrayal would mean destroying your own family. The reconnaissance phase began in early 1972. Dinsio made 3 separate trips to Los Angeles, each time staying for weeks, each visit serving a different purpose. The first was purely observational. He rented safety deposit boxes at multiple banks to study their procedures, noting how guards rotated, when foot traffic peaked, how long customers typically spent in the vault area. He visited the United California Bank as a potential commercial client, taking the tour they so proudly offered, asking technical questions disguised as due diligence, photographing the vault door under the pretense of showing his business partners back in Ohio. The second trip focused on the building's external architecture. He walked the surrounding blocks at different times of day, mapping sight lines and police patrol patterns. He studied the building's utilities, where power lines entered, how the ventilation systems were configured, whether there were basement access points or neighboring structures that might provide unconventional entry routes. He did this with the casual patience of someone who appeared to simply be killing time, stopping for coffee at the shop across the street, where he could watch employees arrive and depart, learning their schedules without ever speaking to them. The third reconnaissance trip brought Mulligan. Together, they posed as contractors evaluating the building's alarm systems for a security consultation firm they'd invented. They carried clipboards and wore business casual attire, speaking the technical language fluently enough that building staff simply assumed they belonged there. They traced wire conduits, identified junction boxes, mapped the redundant alarm circuits that the bank considered its fail-safe against tampering. Every observation was photographed, every detail recorded in notebooks that would later be transferred to detailed diagrams back in Ohio. What emerged from these months of study wasn't a Hollywood heist plan, but something more resembling an engineering project. Dinsio and his team built scale models of the vault using cardboard and wood, working through different approaches, testing theories about how security systems responded to various triggers. They obtained the same type of concrete and steel used in the vault's construction and practiced cutting through it in a rented warehouse, timing how long each method took, measuring noise levels, understanding what tools would be required and in what sequence. The psychological weight of this preparation phase was its own challenge. Each member of the crew maintained their normal lives, jobs, family obligations, social routines, while carrying the knowledge of what they were planning. Dinsio's wife knew he traveled for work, but didn't ask questions she probably didn't want answered. His children saw him spending long hours in the garage, but assumed he was working on home projects. The compartmentalization required wasn't just operational security, it was emotional management, the ability to exist in two realities simultaneously without letting either contaminate the other. By late February 1972, they had refined their approach to something that felt incredibly like it might actually work, not through force or speed, but through systematic exploitation of assumptions built into the vault's design. They'd identified a vulnerability so specific, so dependent on precise timing and technique that it apparently never occurred to the engineers who built the system. The plan required patience, silence, and nearly perfect execution over the course of an entire weekend. They set the date for March. The final preparations took on a meditative quality, acquiring tools, arranging logistics, mentally rehearsing each step until it became automatic. There was no bravado, no celebration, just the quiet certainty that comes from having done everything possible to turn an impossible idea into an achievable reality. Chapter 3. They entered the building on Friday evening, March 24, 1972, through a rooftop access point that required nothing more dramatic than a copied key and an understanding of when security patrols shifted floors. Dinsio had chosen the weekend deliberately. Banks were closed, the building would be largely empty, and they would have nearly 60 hours before anyone discovered what had happened. The team moved through the darkened hallways with the quiet efficiency of people who had rehearsed every step, carrying their tools in nondescript bags that could have contained maintenance equipment or office supplies. The vulnerability they'd identified existed not in the vault door itself, but in the architectural space surrounding it. The designers had focused so intensely on making the vault impenetrable from the front that they'd made a subtle miscalculation about the ceiling above it. The concrete was reinforced, certainly, but it was also part of the building's structural system, which meant it couldn't be made as thick as the vault walls without compromising the floor above. More importantly, the alarm sensors embedded in the ceiling were designed to detect sudden impacts or rapid temperature changes, the signature of explosives or cutting torches. They weren't calibrated for slow, patient work conducted over many hours. Dinsio's team set up in the office directly above the vault. They laid down blankets to muffle sound and began the painstaking process of drilling through the concrete using a technique Dinsio had developed specifically for this job. Instead of power tools that would generate heat and vibration, they used hand-operated core drills, working in shifts, each rotation carefully controlled. The concrete dust was collected in bags as they worked, preventing it from falling through cracks that might alert anyone below. The process was exhausting and monotonous. 6 inches of progress might take 4 hours. But monotony was safety. Monotony was invisible. By Saturday afternoon, they'd created an opening large enough to lower a man through. The moment carried a strange absence of triumph. They were too deep into the operation for celebration, too aware that the hardest part was yet to come. Mulligan descended first, his feet touching the vault floor in near total darkness, his flashlight revealing rows of safety deposit boxes that represented years of accumulated wealth and trust. The silence in that space was absolute, almost sacred. They were standing in a place designed to be inviolable, and for a few hours they were the only people in the world who knew that assumption had been wrong. The safety deposit boxes themselves were simpler to breach than the vault. Using drill bits specifically chosen to defeat the cylinder locks, they worked through box after box with mechanical precision. They took jewelry, cash, bearer bonds, gold coins, anything with immediate value that could be transported. But they also encountered things they hadn't anticipated. Family photographs stored alongside heirlooms, letters, personal documents that clearly held meaning beyond monetary worth. These items they left untouched, a small gesture that spoke to some residual boundary, even in the midst of theft. The complication came late Sunday morning. One of the drill bits broke inside a lock cylinder, and for 20 tense minutes they worked to extract it without triggering the box's internal jam mechanism. Time, which had seemed abundant when they started, suddenly felt compressed. Dinsio made the decision to leave several boxes unopened rather than risk extending their window. They gathered their tools, checked methodically for anything left behind, and exited the way they'd come, sealing the ceiling opening as best they could from above. By Sunday evening, they were driving east in a rented van, the vault's contents distributed in hidden compartments, the crew maintaining the same careful composure they'd held throughout. The discovery came Monday morning when the vault manager opened for business and immediately noticed concrete dust on the floor. The subsequent investigation unfolded with the slow horror of an institution realizing its foundational assumptions had been shattered. FBI agents walked through the scene with a mixture of professional fascination and disbelief. The technique was so unusual, so patient, that it took them hours to fully understand how the breach had been achieved. The press coverage was immediate and extensive, not just because of the estimated $30 million taken, but because of what it represented. The vault that couldn't be cracked had been cracked, and not through force or insider betrayal, but through careful study and methodical execution. For the people who'd stored their valuables there, the theft was more than financial loss. It was a violation of trust in systems they'd been assured were absolute. Insurance covered some losses, but not the psychological impact of learning that the safest place they knew had been compromised. The bank implemented new security measures, as did institutions across the country, each one adding layers to prevent a repeat of this specific technique. But the fundamental lesson remained uncomfortable. Every security system was designed by people making assumptions about how it might be attacked, and those assumptions created the very vulnerabilities they were meant to eliminate. Dinsio and most of his crew were eventually caught, not through forensics or surveillance, but through the same weakness that undermines most criminal enterprises: the difficulty of converting stolen goods to cash without leaving traces. The careful planning that got them into the vault couldn't protect them from the economic realities of laundering millions in stolen property. They were arrested in Ohio 18 months later, the investigation tracing back through pawn shops and fences to the family connections that had seemed like such an advantage during planning. The legacy of the United California bank robbery wasn't the money taken or the convictions that followed. It was the quiet demonstration that perfection in security, like perfection in any human endeavor, was always theoretical. The vault was exactly what its designers promised: a masterpiece of engineering and paranoia. But standing against it was something equally human: patience, observation, and the willingness to question whether impossible truly meant impossible. The answer, it turned out, was written in concrete dust on a vault floor one Monday morning, waiting to be discovered.